Is there food out there? We're never going to get them back. Even though it's 10:30. So let's begin. I want to talk a little bit about the European experience of our forebears. To be more general, less specific. I want to ask a lot of questions. A famous man once said that questions are much more important than answers. So this is going to be terribly important because there's a lot of questions. Okay. The European experience, united or divided. I want to just have 3 slides to sort of review from last session. This, I think, is the very essence of Anabaptism. Jesus meant what he said and was talking to us. I think the Anabaptists did an amazing job, modeled in some ways the keeping balance between works and faith, between behavior and belief, insisting that you had to have both, between Christ and Jesus. I like to separate Christ and Jesus, not because we're not talking about the same thing, but it's a terminological thing for me. Jesus is the man who lived in Palestine. Christ is the Son of God. And whereas we might reasonably, we could at least aspire to make Jesus an example, we ain't got no chance of making Christ the example. So the Anabaptists affirm both, although they almost always use the term Christ. And finally, between vertical and horizontal commitments. Love the Lord your God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That if you're all one or the other, you're in trouble. You need to balance those. Okay, this is an old map showing the spread of the Swiss Mennonites. What I find interesting about this is that we Swiss Volenians did every one of those except go to the Netherlands. Now, we came to the United States in 1874, not in 1711, but does this thing work? Oh, kind of. We obviously were in Alsace-Lorraine. We were in South Germany. We were in Galicia. We were in Mickelsdorf. And some of us were even with the Hutterites. And then, this is a map that you probably want to look at sometime, and we don't have enough time to go over it now. But in virtually, you can point in Kansas to where all of these groups emigrated from. Some examples. What do we got? Where's my... Yeah, come on. Oh, okay. Obviously, these people around... no, that's Mound Ridge. Well, forget it. I can't see good enough. But I can point out a couple. Hanston and Partridge. No, Hanston, these people came from Galicia. Our folk, both of our groups were in Galicia, but most of us went on from there. Some of them came to the United States after that. The Hanston Mennonite Church, I just learned, its first name was the Einsiedel Mennonite Church because they came from Einsiedel in Galicia. Yeah, the Swiss, pure Swiss came, Swiss Mennonite Church in Whitewater, which hasn't been Mennonite for half a century. Obviously, the Swiss Volenians, the South Germans, Halstead, and some at Mount Ridge, people who emigrated directly from South Germany. And then the Low Germans. All of that is the Moluchna folks. There were other Low Germans. There were Low Germans from Volhynia, Grace Hill Mennonite Church. From the Canton Mennonite Church, Pawnee Rock. Those were Low Germans in Volhynia, with whom Elder Jacob Stuckey had a very special relationship. But that's in the next hour, so we can't go there. Okay, a little more on the birth of Anabaptism. I think you know this story. First rebaptism, January 21, 1525. Within a few months, Anabaptism emerges in Bern. By 1527, both Zurich and Bern are making Anabaptist activity. I'm never going to last till 2:30. Making Anabaptist activity punishable by drowning. And nevertheless, the Bernese Anabaptists flourished in the Emmental Valley. You know, one of the interesting things about religious history is that the church always grows during persecution and almost always suffers during prosperity. So you can think about that one a while. Why the persecution? Loss of control. Conrad Grebel's rebaptizing of George Blaurock has been called the single most radical act of the Protestant Reformation because it ruptured Corpus Christianum, Christendom, this idea that the church and the state are one, that when these people killed Anabaptists, it might have been the church doing it, or it might have been the state doing it, made absolutely no difference. This was a church state or a state church. The Anabaptists absolutely insisted on the separation of church and state, and I'm very curious how they would look upon the current push by some people to try much harder to make our country Christian. Adult baptism. State no longer has a way to keep track of its inhabitants. Infant baptism is a civil act as well as a religious act. State has to deal with Anabaptists who refuse to swear an oath of loyalty to the state. State has to deal with Anabaptists who refuse to take up the sword against the Turks to defend the state. The Turks in the 1820s are threatening to take over all of Europe. We worry about ISIS. No different in the 1520s. And the Anabaptists said, no, you can't take up the sword. Jesus told us to put away the sword. Okay, persecution leads to endogamy. I'm going to talk about endogamy frequently because I think it's very, very important in figuring out why our communities react the way they do. And persecution leads to the Stillen im Lande. If you want to know how serious this endogamy is, Nathan Stuckey is my first cousin once removed. I'm a first cousin to his mother, Nancy. I checked on Grandma just to see how many other ways Nathan and I are related. we're related 227 ways. Then I wondered, since there were basically 4 groups of Swiss Volhynians who came to the United States in 1874, 3 of them went to Freeman. The 4th was planning to come to Freeman, but somebody changed their mind and they came to Mound Ridge instead. So I wondered, are we related to the Freeman people too? Those of you who were here for the Schweitzer's Talking Readers Theater saw Karen Kaufman Wall. Karen was born in Freeman, grew up in Freeman, East Freeman, she would specify. And I was sitting at Mojo's once and I saw her there, so I thought, I'm going to check on Grandma, see whether Karen and I are related. Well, we are 4th cousins, but we are related 197 other ways. This endogamy is serious stuff. And it becomes especially serious, I think, when there is tension in a community. You know, when someone crosses you who is an outsider, different religion, different geography, etc., you can sort of say, well, what can you expect? When somebody crosses you who is a first cousin, whose parents came over on the city of Richmond, etc., that's a completely different experience. Because this person, for all intents and purposes, has had exactly the same experiences that you've had. And still, they crossed you. So keep that in mind. Endogamy, that's your $50 word for today. It means in-group marriage. Okay, immigration timeline. Anabaptism begins in Zurich and then goes to, here's the Swiss map. You see Zurich up there. We know that some of us came from Zurich. How do we know that? Well, Conrad Grebel's paternal grandfather was a Stuckey, so that might have something to do with it. More seriously, we've got Zurgers. And Zurger is a name that comes from Zurich, somebody from Zurich. But most of us were from the Emmental Valley, southeast of Bern. Okay, the first big move is to Alsace. You all know where Alsace is. It's on the eastern border of France, between France and Germany. And then about 1650, the Elector Karl Ludwig of Palatine invites our ancestors to the Palatinate in Germany. The 30 Years' War had just ended. The Palatinate, as most of Europe, was devastated. And Karl Ludwig wanted some people to come and try to resurrect agriculture, etc., in this ruined land. And here's where the Palatinate is. German word is Pfalz, the Pfalz. Then there was the last incident of active persecution of our ancestors. Louis XIV of France said, I don't want all these Mennonites in Alsace. I want them out of here. So most of them, I mean, I'm sure some of them moved to the United States and settled in Virginia and Pennsylvania and became MCs. But many of them moved to Montbéliard, which was farther south, farther up in the mountains, so a little more isolated. So we end up with two groups: those who went to the Palatinate and those who were from Montbéliard. Remember those two things. Those are the two distinct groups of our ancestors. I think we often assume that we were all one big happy family. No, we were different. Palatinate is in Germany, Montbéliard is in France. Notice that they were there for over 100 years in both cases. You think there weren't some cultural influences? I know they were an isolated people, but one of the obvious facts of history is that Mennonites have always been influenced by their culture. If you don't believe it, look in the mirror. Anyway, then there is a big division between Jacob Amann and Hans Reist. Jacob Amann believes that the Mennonites have gone soft, and he is convinced that when you excommunicate somebody, you should avoid them. Meidung is the German term. And the Mennonites weren't doing that. Now, Jacob Amann thought that that was a violation of what Jesus said, and he believed that Jesus meant what he said and was talking to us. And you know where this comes from. This comes from Matthew 18. If your brother sins, you go and talk to him. If that doesn't work, you take two or three. If that doesn't work, you take him before the congregation. And if that doesn't work, let him be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Obviously, Jacob Amann thought that we should never have dealings with Gentiles and tax collectors. Unfortunately for Jacob Amann, in my mind, is those are exactly the people that Jesus dealt with all the time. So I happen to think that the Meidung is dead wrong. At least it's dead wrong if you're trying to base it on the example of Jesus. Hans Reist, another Mennonite leader, about whom we actually know very little, don't know exactly where he was born, or he was okay with excommunication. He was not okay with avoidance. Treuherzige. The Treuherzige were people who were very, very nice to the Mennonites, but weren't Mennonite. Very nice people, not Mennonite. Jacob Amann said they couldn't be saved. They don't make the cut. Hans Reist said, well, yeah. It's not only going to be Mennonites in heaven, come on. Excommunication for liars. Reist says that's too extreme. Uniformity and simplicity in dress. You have to use hooks and eyes, not buttons. Reist says that's not that important. God doesn't care if you use buttons. Couldn't attend state church services. No idea what Reist's opinion of that is, but I have an idea. The Montbéliard Swiss, I think uniformly, decide to follow Jacob Amann. They become Amish. The Palatinate Swiss follow Hans Reist. There is your first division. Not just division on the basis of country, but division on the basis of Amish or non-Amish. I don't know how many of you have seen this film, this video. If you have not, you need to look at it. I can't believe that we're not showing it this weekend. I think that's a major mistake. The first time I saw this, and it's old, it's 20 years old, but I still think it's very, very useful. First time I saw this, I felt like I understood my father in a brand new way. You'll see in a minute that there is a lot of question about who in the Sam Hill the Schrags were, because they were all over the place. But I'm pretty sure my Schrags were Amish, because I'm sure my dad, he exhibited too many Amish tendencies. Now, you can find this on the internet. It's on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, give the title, or John Ruth, who was the person who put it together. I want to show you just a tiny segment, because it's going to show us another division.
When Amish communities change, they often take on evangelistic interests. John Fisher comments on this tendency.
In my teen years, I felt a change coming about certain areas of the Amish church. The closer to the urban settings, the more affected it was. Where Amish families felt suddenly that they get a bigger blessing out of reading the Bible in English and studying it in English for the first time, and felt that when they verbalized this, they created an estrangement in the church, and in all sincerity felt they had to leave the church. But they were followed by a large faction who were looking for an osret or an excuse to do the same thing, because really what they wanted was cars and modern machinery.
If you want to explore this Amish thing more, there's a book by James Crable out there. There are these two papers that are on the Schmecca website. I won't go to great detail here, but here is James Crable's chart in one of those selections. You have definitely Amish, and you see that that's the largest group. You have maybe Amish. You have probably not Amish. You have definitely not Amish. You've got Hutterites. You've got Galatian Mennonites. And you've got one who actually became Lutheran. Now, one of the things you're going to notice, any of you who are my relatives, why do I always have a hard time with this? Well, maybe you can see, oh, there it is. We got two Schrags who are definitely Amish. We got two Schrags who are definitely not Amish. We got three Schrags who became Hutterites. We got two Schrags who were Galatians. We got one Schrag who threw up her hands and married a Lutheran. The other thing I want you to notice here is the Crables are very probably not Amish. The Zergers are definitely not Amish. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to it later. I got to find this quote by James Crable when he talks about the Schrags. He says, the problem in determining the Amish membership of the Schrag family is that they were everything everywhere. They also apparently are a family that has a hard time making up their mind, and my wife will assure you that that has been passed down through the generations. Okay, then something else happens, and it happens initially in Germany. It is Pietism. Pietism was founded by Philip Spener, who was a Lutheran pastor, concerned that the doctrinal and rational heritage of Lutheran theology had become dry and rational and unmoving, and he wanted heart religion. He wanted to get much more emotion into the religious expression. Strong emphasis on conversion, second coming of Christ, parallels in Methodism, revivalism, fundamentalism, reform in the education of ministers, also nonconformity to worldliness, no dancing, theater, card playing, alcohol, priesthood of believers, more extensive use of the Bible, restraint and charity in religious controversies. Now, the standard explanation of the relationship between pietism and Anabaptism is that they were fundamentally inimical. They were totally opposite. Robert Friedman in 1949 wrote a book called Anabaptist Piety Through the Centuries, when he looked at pietism and said, no, it goes against too many of the Amish principles, the Anabaptist principles. You just saw that in that little clip from John Ruth's film, where people who go to a more evangelistic, conversion-based experience step out of the community, that it's a way out. Community no longer matters as much. It's much more individual. It's much more concerned about the vertical and less concerned about the horizontal. Horizontal is very, very important to the Amish and to the Anabaptists. Pilgrim Marpeck, you cannot be a Christian alone. Anyway. Okay. Now, you would assume that pietism primarily affects the Palatinate Swiss, but it clearly affects the Montbéliard Swiss as well, because we know Elder Jacob Stuckey came from Montbéliard, and here is a quote. If you want to see a model quotation of a pietist, there it is. That's pietism in a nutshell. Okay, around 1790, it's off to Poland. Now, I make a big deal about the fact that we went to Poland, even though there's a whole lot more acceptance of that in the Swiss Volinian community today than there once was. As a kid, I was always taught we came from Russia. We were in Russia. In fact, we were in Russian Poland, which is different, significantly different from being in Russia. And let me tell you why. This is a map of Poland in the 18th century. Everything that is colored is the boundary of Poland, except for this little white place, which is East Prussia. And starting in 1772 and continuing till 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria literally took Poland off the map. There was no Poland. Now, clearly there were Polish people living there, and Polish nobles who were inviting our ancestors to come to their property. And here you see, I said persecution ended with Montbéliard. From then on, virtually all of our emigrations were a result of being invited somewhere. We're completely on the other side. It isn't, I'm trying to get rid of you. Now, you can argue about Alexander II. We'll get to that. But even then, he wasn't trying to get rid of them. He was just wanting them to change, and they didn't want to change that way. Now, I want you to look at two places. You probably can't see them, but one of them is here. It's Lvav. And one of them is here. It's Zhytomyr. And virtually all of our Swiss villages were between those two places. So we were either in Polish Austria or we were in Polish Russia. Oh, wrong button. Well, why make such a big deal about Poland? Partly, I said, it's because I think we've ignored it. Partly, I think we should acknowledge that most of our ethnic foods are Polish. Not Russian, not Swiss. Now, I assume you all have a copy of my cousin Jeanette Wiedel's Swiss Volinian favorite recipes. I want to compliment Jeanette because she does a very good job of acknowledging the Polish roots of many, if not most, of those ethnic foods. Okay, what's this? Nalesniki. Okay. Margot and I were in Poland in 2018, and we found a restaurant that only served nalesniki. It's the Polish word for pancake. It's also the Ukrainian word for pancake. So that complicates it a little bit. What's this? Poppy seed roll. You ever wonder why we call this Mockkuchen? I remember asking my dad, I said, is Mock the German word for poppy seed? He said, no. German word for poppy seed is Mohn. I said, so why isn't it Mohnkuchen? He didn't know. I could help him if he were here. Mock is the Polish word for poppy. Now, it also happens to be the Ukrainian word for poppy and the Russian word for poppy, but Mockkuchen, as somebody pointed out last night, is this interesting putting together of a Polish word and a German word, Mockkuchen. The Polish would call poppy seed roll makovic, and the Ukrainians would call it makovyi, but we call it Mockkuchen. So still, we got some problem here because we got Polish words and Ukrainian words. How are you going to choose? How are you going to be sure that you're talking about Polish? This way. What's this? What is it? Case Bragi. Finally, we've got a Swiss Volinian here. Now, those of you who said Veronica were sort of right, because we have formally adopted Veronica as the term for some dry cottage cheese wrapped in dough. That has something to do, I think, with, remember when I showed you how much of this area was settled by Moluchna Mennonites? See, those people called it Veronica because those people actually lived in Ukraine, which of course was then legitimately part of Russia. They were not in Polish Russia. But The Polish would call this pierogi. It's kind of the national dish of Poland. There are all kinds of restaurants that serve nothing but pierogi. And as you can see from this menu, they will put anything into a pierogi. And we did too. We had kraut pierogi. Didn't some people put potatoes in pierogi? I don't remember. And then, of course, we put sweet beans in pierogi. There you go. Yeah, here is just a reminder. This is where our Low German friends were primarily. Here's Zaporozhye. No, I can't see. Anyway, and here's where we were. So we were in Polish Russia, as I said. The other thing about Poland is that I think there's been discrimination over the years. How many of you remember Polish jokes? Yeah. We laughed, oh, Polish people are so dumb. Let's make some jokes about them. And then there's this book by Abe Andrew called The Helpless Poles. Who are these people? They are Holdemen. They are Ostrogers. They lived in Ostrog, which we will see shortly, which was very, very close to where our people lived in Polish Russia. They were Low German. They were a little poorer than we were and had been for some time. I think they were poorer in Poland too. Now, the Low Germans lived in Poland for almost 300 years. Why aren't they helpless Poles? We lived in Poland or Polish Russia or Polish Austria for almost 100 years. Why aren't we helpless Poles? These are the people, incidentally. Oh, here we go. There you see Ostrog. And here's Karasówka, Neumanówka. Those of you from Freeman, Waldheim, Herodische. Where's the other one? Where's the other one? Waldheim, blah, blah, blah. Okay, anyway. Be nice to those Polish people. There's nothing. You should be proud of that heritage every time you eat a case pierogi or a bona pierogi. I don't know why I have this slide here. I asked myself when I went through these slides last time why it's there. I thought I came up with a reason, but I can't. Okay. So you have two groups of eastbound Swiss. You've got the Montbéliard group, which, according to Martin Schrag, includes Stuckys, Kaufmanns, Gehrings, Grabers, Lichties, and Flickingers. You've got the Palatinate group, which includes Krabels, Millers, Schrags, and Zergers. The Montbéliard group doesn't travel as much. Some of them go for a while to Galicia, but not very long at all, and mostly to Erzulin and Mickelsdorf in Polish Austria, then to Edwardsdorf, and I have a question mark behind the Polish because I can't tell on the map whether this is Polish Russia or Polish Austria. I only know it's Polish. And then they go from there to Sohoritz and Herodische and Waldheim and Karasówka and Neumanówka in Polish Russia. The Palatinate group does more. They also go to Galicia, to Einsiedel. Then many of, or at least some of them, join the Hutterites. They go all the way. It's the one time that our people are actually in Russia. We are outside Polish Russia when we go to Vyshenka. Then to Michelin, where we lived for a while with the folks from Grace Hill Mennonite Church. Low Germans who come over in 1874. Then Berezina and Vignanka, and finally Edwardsdorf, which is the first place where these two groups really come together. Now, they're both in Galicia, but in Galicia there's an Amish church and a non-Amish church. In Edwardsdorf, there apparently isn't. It's all one group. And then to Karasówka and Neumanówka. Now, you probably can't read this. There's a lot of intermarriage. This is my grandpa Schrag's family tree. And here we've got somebody born in Palatinate, Montbéliard, Alsace, Montbéliard, Bavaria. Oh, this is Mundelheim, Catholic, who becomes not just a Mennonite, but an Amish bishop. Then here's, a Waldner. If you got any Waldner blood, you got Hutterite blood. Waldner is a purely Hutterite name. What happened is when our people moved to the Hutterite colony, there was a Schrag woman, actually two Schrag women, both of whom I think married Hutterites, and one of them married a Waldner. She had 3 children who then moved to Edwardsdorf, and all of the Waldners are descended from those 3 guys. Okay, Montbéliard, Galicia, and then Volhynia. And there's a map of Volhynia, which you see actually extends a little farther than present-day Ukraine. How many of you watch Finding Your Roots? Oh, more of you should watch that. It's a wonderful show. You ever heard of the Pale of Settlement? What's the Pale of Settlement? It's right there on the screen, for crying out loud. It's the place in the Russian Empire where all of the Jews had to live. So where exactly was the Pale of Settlement? There it is. And if you can read it, you'll see that there's Volhynia right there. It goes all the way clear down to where our Low German friends lived in the Crimea and southern Russia. I have a friend, actually a relative, who remembers talking to her grandmother, and her grandmother remembers talking to her mother, so my friend's great-grandmother, who was born in Volhynia. And when you ask her what was the hardest thing about leaving, she said, it was leaving all of my Jewish friends. Not sure how many of us are aware that our people were obviously living among Jews. Now, P.P. Wadle, in his little short history, claims that the Jews often stole things from the Mennonites. And I'm not sure about that. But a very compatible relationship. The Jews were not farmers, but they had textiles and cooking utensils, etc. And the Mennonites would exchange their goods, their vegetables and fruits and grain with the Jews. Okay, and if you're interested in Ukraine, every one of these places except for Vishenka, which we've already mentioned, and Mickelsdorf and Ursuline, they were in Polish Austria. They might have been a little bit outside Ukraine. I'm not sure. But we do have very, very close ties with what is now Ukraine. Okay, decision to emigrate. Alexander II comes to power in Russia. He wants to make everybody in Russia Russian. He wants to insist that everybody speaks Russian, that the schools only teach Russian, that young men have to serve in the military, in the draft, and the special privileges for these ethnic enclaves. And the Mennonites were given power to have their own schools, et cetera, et cetera. Those were all rescinded. He wants these people to be Russian. Now, when I was growing up, I was always told that the reason we left in 1874 was because of the threat of military service. I have no doubt that that was a factor. I also have no doubt that that wasn't the only factor. We've heard twice the conviction that God spoke German, and they were trying to make God speak Russian, and that wasn't going to work. The other interesting thing is that when the group came to check out the United States, some of them went to visit President U.S. Grant. And they asked him if they could have conscientious objection, if they could be released from any obligation to go to war. And all Grant gave them was, he said, oh, we're not going to have another war here for 50 years. Now, they did get that exemption from states, but they got no exemption from the federal government at that time. In 1881, Alexander II gave exemption from military service to Mennonites by starting the forestry service. So there's a little bit of irony there, I think. Well, they petitioned. Elder Jacob Stuckey went together with Tobias Unruh, one of the Ostlers, to St. Petersburg to try to talk to the Tsar, to try to get some grace here, and there was no grace forthcoming. I don't think they were even allowed to talk to him. So, we've got to go somewhere. Where? At least 4 places were mentioned. There was the United States, there was Australia, there was Turkestan, and there was South America. Obviously, they ended up choosing the United States. They sent a group of 12 scouts in the fall of 1873. And these guys basically checked the prairie states from top to bottom. And most of them, not all of them, decided that the best place was Dakota Territory. And then there's the leaving. I think people know about the leaving. You went overland to a railroad station. Most of these people had never driven on a train. And they rode to Hamburg, Germany, then a ship to Hull, England, then another train across England to Liverpool, and then a steamer to New York. Actually only took them 10 days on the ocean, which I think is pretty amazing. And as I indicated, 3 of them ended up in Freeman, the first 3, And then the last one, August 31, here come the folks on the city of Richmond, and they land in New York with every intention of going to Freeman. But there's actually two people who meet them in New York. Have any idea who that is? It's David Gores. It's probably the most important founder of Bethel College. And he sits down with them and says, "Psh, you guys don't want to go to Freeman. We've got a place for you in South Central Kansas. Come on down." And we did. And here we are, 150 years later. Questions? Turkestan.
When did the Swiss millennium stop being Amish?
Interesting question. One of the ways historians measure whether they were Amish was whether they ascribed to the Essingen discipline of 1779. And what they used to do is every time they moved to a place, they would sign the Essingen discipline. I'll say more about that in the next session if I have any voice left. And the last time they ever signed, that we know that they signed the Essingen discipline, was in Edwardsdorf, 1807. So it was not signed in Sohoritz or Hodische or Kadasovka or Neumanovka as far as we know. So early 19th century. And it's a technical description. As I told you, I think in many, many ways my father was Amish. I think in an amazing number of ways I still have Amish tendencies. But I haven't signed the Essingen discipline of 1779, and neither did my dad. Yeah.
We don't underestimate the promise of free land in making the
Oh. Well, thank you. Thank you. Did I underestimate the promise of free land? Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. It's the other thing that I want to say. Since Montbéliard and the Palatinate, every place we went, we were invited. And the railroads were sending emissaries to Russia or to Polish Russia to try to convince these people to come and buy land. And the railroads wanted good farmers because they wanted people to ship their crops on the railroad. So we were able to get free or cheap land. And in many of these places, I'm not sure it was as serious in Volhynia as it was in South Russia, they were running out of land. There was no more land to give to your sons, so you had to find some new land. Yeah. Yeah. The question was, with the interaction between Mennonites and Jews, were there any cases of Mennonites marrying Jews? Was there ever a case of Mennonites speaking Yiddish? I'm not aware of any cases of intermarriage. I think that would have stretched the bonds of endogamy way too far. The Yiddish thing is interesting. What I have tended to hear is that Yiddish has a lot of similarities with Low German. I have not heard people say it has lots of similarities with Schweizerdeutsch, but maybe it does. I don't know the answer. It does with Pennsylvania Dutch. Well, Schweizerdeutsch is very much like Pennsylvania Dutch. Thank you, John Sharp.
Question.
Yeah.
What about the Weedles?
What about the Weedles? The Weedles were Low German. They came into a Weedle married a Swiss in Galicia or maybe Mechelen. And that's all it took. You get one Weedle, you're home free. Now, my late uncle, Ben Weedle, who often had a fairly dim view of Low Germans, when my late brother-in-law, Warner Franzen, told him that Weedle was a Low German name, he was not happy. Kate.
When you talk about your father being Amish and your having Amish tendencies, are you making a theological or a cultural comment?
Maybe a little bit of both. I would be tempted to say more cultural. But I talked this morning in the first session about how these Anabaptists thought Scripture. So every time they were in a situation, they wondered, what would Jesus do? What would Scripture tell me to do? That is exactly the way my father functioned. Just exactly. The Amish do not do any what? The only prayer they will pray out loud is the Lord's Prayer. Because that's the only prayer Jesus told us to pray. He said all the rest should be done in quiet in a closet, because what you're obviously doing is you're trying to impress people. I think of that every time I'm worship leader at Bethel College Mennonite Church. And you think, oh, God, remember Raylene's prayer last Sunday? That was awesome. How am I going to match that? Well, yeah, I think the Amish had something there. Where are we? Alan.
So we get on a ship and we come across to New York, and we're met by some stranger to come to South Central Kansas. What was the governance to make a decision that quickly when everybody's planning on going to Freeman?
I think the governance is EJS, Elder Jacob Stuckey. I think Elder Jacob Stuckey had more authority and power in this group than we can even imagine. I'll say a little more about that next session. Maybe a safer way to say it is that I'll guarantee you it wouldn't have happened if he didn't agree. Maybe he didn't make it all by himself. Yeah.
You spoke about the Maidan, the avoidance. So did Rice do away with that altogether? So I'm a Holdeman, and we still practice a form of that. So did that get reintroduced at some point? That just interested me. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know, but I don't think so. Now, Rice kept excommunication. He still had the ban, but I don't think he ever shifted back to avoidance, or, he probably wouldn't have. The question is, did the Latinate folks ever shift back to avoidance? And I'm not aware. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What I tried to do is separate the things from the top and the things from the bottom. The bottom ones, I think, were Amish and potentially Anabaptist. It was the top things, this whole idea of emotion that our Amish friend in the video spoke sort of disparagingly about. There's a marvelous Stanley Hauerwas tells about the Mennonite farmer. I'm inclined to think it was an Amish farmer in Shipshewana, Indiana, outside the Yoder's dry goods store. And two evangelists come up and ask him if he is saved. He assumes it's a serious question, so he asks for a piece of paper and a pencil, and he writes 10 names down on the list. He explains that he knows 7 of these people fairly well. The other 3, he's had business contact with them, etc., but don't know him well. And he tells the evangelist, if you want to know if I'm saved, go ask these people. That's not a question I would ever answer for myself. Amish historically don't spend a lot of time in God talk. It's, does my behavior give evidence that I am saved? Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much.